Colonel Frank Mitchell had served 42 years in the British Army before retiring 5 years ago at the age of 65. He was a decorated veteran who had commanded troops in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several peacekeeping missions around the world. His chest bore the ribbons of numerous medals, including the Distinguished Service, Order, and the Military Cross. Frank took enormous pride in his military service and believed that his generation of soldiers presented the pinnacle of military discipline and strength. On this crisp November morning, Frank was walking through central London with his grandson Jamie, a curious 12-year-old who was visiting from Scotland for the school holidays. Jamie had begged his grandfather to take him to see the famous royal guards at Buckingham Palace. Having heard stories about their colorful uniforms and their legendary ability to remain completely motionless for hours at a time, Frank agreed to the visit, though privately he had always viewed the royal guards as little more than ceremonial decoration. In his opinion, these young men in their elaborate red uniforms and tall black hats were nothing more than tourist attractions who played dress-up for the cameras. He had served in real combat zones, where soldiers faced life-and-death situations daily, and he found it difficult to respect guards whose primary job seemed to be standing still and looking impressive for visitors. "Grandpa," Jamie said excitedly as they approached the palace gates, "do you think the guards are as tough as real soldiers?" Frank chuckled at his grandson's innocent question, ruffling the boy's dark hair affectionately. "Not quite, lad," Frank replied with a knowing smile. "These fellows are more for show than anything else. They're probably good enough soldiers, but they're not what I'd call battle-tested. They spend their days posing for pictures rather than training for real combat." His voice carried the confidence of someone who had seen actual warfare and believed. His experience gave him superior knowledge about what made a true soldier, as they joined the crowd of tourists gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Frank noticed one particular guard standing at his post near the main entrance. The young man appeared to be in his late 20s, with the perfect posture and stoic expression that tourists expected from royal guards. His uniform was immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his rifle held at precisely the correct angle. "Look at that one, Jamie," Frank said, nodding toward the guard. "Standing there like a statue, probably thinking about what he's going to have for lunch rather than staying alert for any real threats. When I was commanding troops in Afghanistan, my soldiers had to stay focused on actual dangers, not just pose for photographs." Jamie looked at the guard with fascination, but Frank's dismissive comments were starting to color the boy's perception. Frank's voice had carried further than he intended, and several other tourists turned to listen to his commentary, found himself enjoying the audience, launching into stories about his own military service and explaining why ceremonial guards couldn't compare to soldiers who had faced real combat. His tone grew increasingly condescending as he warmed to his subject. "These royal guards go through some basic training, I'm sure," Frank continued, speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "But they've never had to make split-second decisions under enemy fire. They've never had to carry wounded comrades to safety or lead men through real danger. It's all pageantry and tradition, nothing more." Some tourists nodded along with his assessment, as impressed by his obvious military experience and medals. The guard Frank was criticizing remained perfectly still, giving no indication that he could hear the retired colonel's disparaging remarks. His eyes stayed focused straight ahead, his breathing remained controlled, and his grip on his rifle never wavered. To Frank, this lack of reaction only confirmed his belief that the guard was essentially decorative rather than functional. Jamie looked back and forth between his grandfather and the motionless guard, sensing tension in the air despite not fully understanding the adult dynamics at play. "Grandpa," he whispered, "maybe we shouldn't talk so loudly about him while he's right there." The 12-year-old's instinctive politeness contrasted sharply with his grandfather's growing arrogance. Frank dismissed Jamie's concern with a wave of his hand. "Don't worry, lad. These guards are trained to ignore everything around them. Probably can't even hear us, and even if he could, what's he going to do about it? His job is to stand there and look pretty for the tourists." Frank's confidence in his assessment was absolute, built on decades of military service that he believed made him uniquely qualified to judge other soldiers. What Frank didn't know was that the guard he was mocking, Lance Corporal David Thompson, had completed 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan before being selected for ceremonial duties at the palace. David had seen combat, had been wounded in action, and had been decorated for valor under fire. His assignment to the Royal Guard wasn't a cushy posting for inexperienced soldiers, but rather an honor reserved for the most disciplined and capable members of the British Army. David had been listening to Frank's commentary for several minutes, and while his training required him to maintain his stoic composure, the retired colonel's dismissive remarks were beginning to test his professional discipline. David had enormous respect for veteran officers like Frank, but he also took pride in his own service and that of his fellow guards, many of whom had extensive combat experience. The crowd around Frank continued to grow as more tourists stopped to listen to his authoritative-sounding commentary about military service and the differences between real soldiers and ceremonial guards. Frank basked in the attention, feeling validated by what he perceived as agreement from his audience. He had no idea that his words were about to be challenged in a way that would completely alter his understanding of the young man standing silently before him. Frank's commentary grew bolder as he gained confidence from his growing audience. He began pointing directly at David while explaining to the tourists and his grandson what he perceived as the fundamental differences between ceremonial soldiers and combat veterans. His military bearing and obvious experience lent authority to his words, even as they became increasingly dismissive and disrespectful. "You see how he just stands there?" Frank said, gesturing toward David with the casual arrogance of someone who believed his own service record gave him the right to criticize others. "That's all these guards do. Stand in one spot, look straight ahead, and hope nothing challenging happens during their shift. When I was leading patrols in Helmand Province, my men had to be ready for anything at any moment." Jamie shifted uncomfortably beside his grandfather, increasingly aware that the guard they were discussing was close enough to hear every word, despite being only 12 years old. Jamie's natural empathy made him feel bad about talking so openly about someone who couldn't respond or defend himself. "Grandpa," he whispered again, tugging on Frank's sleeve. "Maybe he can hear us." Frank laughed dismissively at his grandson's concern. "Even if he can hear us, what's he going to do? Break character and have a conversation?" These guards are trained to be human statues, nothing more. They probably practice standing still more than they practice actual soldiering. His voice carried clearly across the area, drawing more attention from passers-by who were curious about the confident military veteran holding court near the palace gates. Several tourists began taking photos of Frank as he spoke, treating him as an unofficial tour guide who could provide insider knowledge about military matters. Frank enjoyed the attention immensely, straightening his shoulders and speaking with even greater authority as he continued his critique of the ceremonial guards. "I commanded over 200 soldiers during my final deployment," Frank announced proudly. "Men who faced real danger every single day, who made life-and-death decisions under pressure, who carried their wounded brothers to safety under enemy fire. That's what real military service looks like, not this elaborate game of dress-up for the entertainment of tourists." David continued to maintain his professional composure, but Frank's increasingly personal attacks were beginning to wear on his patience. David had served under officers similar to Frank during his combat deployments, and he had enormous respect for veteran leadership. However, Frank's assumption that ceremonial guards lacked real military experience was not only wrong, but also deeply insulting to David and his colleagues. As Frank warmed to his subject, began sharing specific stories from his own service, comparing them unfavorably to what he imagined was the cushy lifestyle of royal guards. "These young men probably think they're having a tough day if their uniform gets wrinkled, or if they have to stand outside in light rain," he said, with obvious contempt. "They have no idea what real hardship looks like." A middle-aged woman in the crowd spoke up, seemingly impressed by Frank's credentials. "It must be frustrating for someone with your experience to see military service reduced to pageantry," she commented, encouraging Frank to continue his commentary. Frank nodded vigorously, pleased to have found a sympathetic voice in his audience. "Exactly," Frank replied enthusiastically. "The military is supposed to be about strength, courage, and the ability to face genuine threats. These guards are just performers in elaborate costumes. I doubt any of them have ever heard a shot fired in anger or had to make the kind of split-second decisions that separate real soldiers from weekend warriors. Unknown to Frank, several other royal guards at nearby posts had begun to take notice of his loud commentary. While they maintained their professional positions and expressions, word was quietly being passed among them about the retired colonel who was publicly dismissing their service and capabilities. David wasn't the only guard who had combat experience, and Frank's assumptions about their backgrounds were becoming increasingly offensive to the entire unit. Jamie looked up at his grandfather with growing concern, finally working up the courage to express his discomfort more directly. "Grandpa, I think we should stop talking about him now. Doesn't seem very nice to say these things when he's right there and can't say anything back." The boy's moral compass was more accurate than his grandfather's. Even at his young age, Frank patted Jamie's head condescendingly, missing the wisdom in his grandson's observation. "Don't worry about hurting his feelings, lad. Professional soldiers learn to handle criticism, and if he's truly professional, he won't let words affect his performance. Besides, I'm just pointing out the obvious differences between ceremonial duty and real military service." The irony of Frank's statement was lost on him completely. He was criticizing David for being unable to respond while simultaneously using that enforced silence to make increasingly harsh judgments about the guard's character and capabilities. Frank's military experience, which should have taught him to respect fellow service members, was instead being used to justify his dismissive attitude toward soldiers whose duties he didn't fully understand. David's training in maintaining composure under all circumstances was being tested more severely than it had been in months. The verbal attacks from Frank were more challenging to endure than the usual tourist pranks or attempts to make him break character. Being dismissed as inexperienced and weak by a fellow soldier, especially a veteran officer, cut deeper than casual mockery from civilians. As Frank's commentary continued, drawing an even larger crowd of interested tourists, David made a decision that would surprise everyone present. The retired colonel was about to learn that his assumptions about the young guard were not just wrong, but dangerously misguided. Frank's voice grew even more confident as his audience expanded to nearly 30 people, all listening intently to his critique of the royal guards. He began to pace slightly as he spoke, unconsciously adopting the commanding presence he had used when addressing troops during his active service years. His grandson Jamie had stopped trying to discourage him, recognizing that his grandfather was too caught up in the attention to listen to a 12-year-old's concerns about politeness. "Let me tell you what real military discipline looks like," Frank announced, pointing again at David, who remained motionless at his post. "It's not about standing pretty for photographs. It's about making impossible decisions under pressure, about leading men through situations where one mistake means death. These ceremonial guards have never faced anything more challenging than bad weather or rude tourists." Frank's confidence was absolute as he continued his monologue, unaware that his words were being heard by someone far more qualified to judge military service than anyone else in the crowd. "I've been in firefights that lasted hours, where keeping your head clear meant the difference between bringing your soldiers home alive or in body bags. That's the kind of pressure that creates real soldiers, not whatever training these palace guards go through." Several tourists began asking Frank questions about his own service, treating him like a military expert whose opinions carried special weight. Frank basked in their attention, sharing increasingly dramatic stories from his deployments, while continuing to contrast his real military experience with what he perceived as the soft duty of ceremonial guards. "The problem with today's military," Frank said, expanding his critique beyond just the royal guards, "is that too many young soldiers think they can serve their country without ever facing real danger. They choose comfortable assignments like this one, where the biggest risk is probably getting a sunburn from standing outside too long." David had been listening to Frank's commentary for nearly 20 minutes, and the retired colonel's assumptions about his background and experience had become increasingly difficult to bear in silence. David's own military record included a Purple Heart equivalent for wounds received in combat, a commendation for valor during a particularly fierce battle in Afghanistan, and the respect of every soldier who had served alongside him in dangerous conditions. The breaking point came when Frank made a particularly harsh observation about the courage of ceremonial guards. "The truth is," Frank declared to his attentive audience, These young men have probably never even heard gunfire outside of a training range. They've certainly never had to keep functioning while their friends were dying around them. Never had. To make life or death decisions for other people's sons and daughters. At that moment, David made a decision that surprised even himself. Slowly, with the precise military bearing that came from years of training and combat experience, David began to move. The crowd fell silent as they realized that the guard they had been discussing was breaking his stoic pose. Frank's confident expression began to falter as he realized his statue was actually a human being who had been listening to every word. David stepped forward with perfect military precision, his movements controlled and purposeful rather than angry or aggressive. He stopped directly in front of Frank, maintaining the respectful posture that his training demanded. Even as he prepared to address the retired colonel's misconceptions about his service and character, "Sir," David said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "With respect, I believe there are some things you should know about the soldiers you've been discussing." His tone was professional and respectful, acknowledging Frank's rank and service while also making it clear that he had something important to say. Frank was momentarily speechless, caught off guard by the guard's unexpected response and the obvious military bearing evident in his manner of speaking. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Jamie looked up at his grandfather with wide eyes, finally understanding that the situation was about to change dramatically. David reached into his uniform jacket with slow, deliberate movements, ensuring that his actions wouldn't be misinterpreted as threatening or disrespectful. He withdrew a small leather folder that contained his military identification and service record, documents that would tell a very different story about his background and qualifications than Frank had been sharing with the crowd. "My name is Lance Corporal David Thompson," David said clearly, opening the folder so that Frank could see his credentials. "I've served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan with the 3rd Battalion, Parachute Regiment. I've been awarded the Military Cross for actions under enemy fire and the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross for leading a rescue operation that saved the lives of 4 wounded soldiers." The silence that followed David's introduction was profound. Frank stared at the documentation in disbelief, realizing that his assumptions about the young guard had been completely wrong. The crowd began to understand that they had just witnessed a decorated combat veteran quietly endure 20 minutes of public criticism based on false assumptions about his experience and courage. David continued speaking, his voice never rising above a conversational tone despite the weight of what he was revealing. "Sir, the Royal Guards are selected from the most experienced and decorated soldiers in the British Army. Every man standing at these posts has completed extensive combat training, and most of us have served in active war zones. This assignment is considered an honor, not a refuge for inexperienced soldiers." Frank felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he processed David's words and credentials. The young man he had dismissed as a decorative soldier was actually a combat veteran with decorations that rivaled Frank's own achievements. The retired colonel's face began to redden as he realized the magnitude of his error and the public nature of his embarrassment. The crowd remained absolutely silent as David carefully returned his credentials to his jacket pocket. Frank stood frozen, struggling to process the complete reversal of everything he had believed about the young guard standing before him. The confident commentary that had flowed so easily just moments before seemed impossible now. As Frank grappled with the reality that he had been publicly criticizing a decorated combat veteran, David's demeanor remained calm and respectful as he continued speaking. "Sir, I want you to know that I have enormous respect for your service record and your leadership experience. Officers like you trained the soldiers who taught me what it means to serve with honor and courage." His words carried no trace of anger or resentment. Despite the 20 minutes of public humiliation he had endured, Frank felt his chest tighten with a mixture of embarrassment and growing respect for the young man before him. Response to being publicly mocked only highlighted the contrast between the guard's professional dignity and Frank's own arrogant assumptions. I had no idea," Frank stammered, his usual confident voice barely above a whisper. "There's no way you could have known, sir," David replied generously. maintaining the military courtesy that had been drilled into him throughout his career. We don't wear our combat decorations on our ceremonial uniforms, and our job here requires us to remain silent even when we're misunderstood or misrepresented. But I wanted you to understand that the soldiers you see at these posts have earned their positions through service, not through avoiding real military duty. Jamie looked up at his grandfather with a mixture of confusion and concern. Sensing the dramatic shift in the atmosphere around them, the 12-year-old didn't fully understand the military significance of what was happening. But he could see that his confident grandfather had become uncomfortable and uncertain in a way that Jamie had never witnessed before. David gestured slightly toward his fellow guards at nearby posts, all of whom remained at perfect attention despite the unusual situation unfolding nearby. The guard to my left served 3 tours in Iraq and was wounded twice while evacuating civilians from a bombed building. The guard behind us was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for holding his position for 6 hours while under heavy enemy fire, allowing his unit to complete their mission and return safely. With each revelation, Frank felt his misconceptions crumbling further. The elaborate uniforms and ceremonial duties that he had dismissed as mere pageantry were actually worn by soldiers whose combat records matched or exceeded his own achievements. His assumption that these guards were inexperienced or soft had been not just wrong, but insultingly wrong, Sir David continued, his tone remaining respectful despite the personal nature of what he was sharing. The night before my first tour in Afghanistan, I was terrified. I had trained for months, but I knew that no amount of preparation could fully prepare me for combat. My commanding officer, a veteran much like yourself, told me something that I've never forgotten. The crowd pressed closer, completely captivated by David's quiet dignity and the unexpected turn the confrontation had taken. Frank found himself leaning forward as well, desperate to understand how badly he had misjudged this remarkable young soldier. He told me that real strength isn't about proving how tough you are or comparing your service to others, David said, his eyes never leaving Frank's face. Real strength is about serving with honor regardless of whether anyone notices or appreciates your sacrifice. He said that the soldiers who need to boast about their courage are usually the ones who have the least of it. Frank felt those words hit him like a physical blow, recognizing the truth in David's gentle rebuke. For 20 minutes, Frank had been boasting about his own service while demeaning others, exactly the kind of behavior that David's officer had warned against. The retired colonel realized that his need to prove his superiority had led him to attack soldiers who deserved his respect and support. David reached into another pocket and withdrew a small photograph, handling it with obvious care. "This was taken during my second deployment, sir. Shows me and 4 other soldiers after we completed a mission to evacuate wounded Afghan civilians from a bombed hospital. We worked for 18 hours straight under enemy fire to save as many people as we could." Frank looked at the photograph and saw David, younger and leaner, but unmistakably the same person. Covered in dust and exhaustion, but with his arm around comrades who looked equally tired and proud. The image captured the kind of brotherhood and sacrifice that Frank remembered from his own combat experience, reminding him of what military service was really about. "We lost 2 good men during that mission," David said quietly, his voice finally showing some of the emotion he had kept carefully controlled throughout the encounter. "But we saved 37 civilians, including 12 children. When I stand at my post here, wearing this uniform, I'm honoring their memory and representing every soldier who has served with courage and dedication." The crowd had grown completely silent, many people wiping away tears as they listened to David's story. Frank felt his own eyes beginning to water as he realized the depth of his misjudgment and the grace with which David was handling his mistake. The young guard's quiet strength and dignity were more impressive than any display of anger or resentment could have been. David carefully returned the photograph to his pocket, straightened to his full military bearing. "Sir, I hope you can understand that we take our duties here very seriously, even if they appear ceremonial to outside observers. Every guard at these posts has earned his position through service and sacrifice, and we're proud to represent the British Army in this capacity." Frank felt a profound sense of shame settling over him as he fully grasped what he had done. He had spent 20 minutes publicly mocking and dismissing a soldier whose service record was exemplary, whose character was beyond reproach, and whose response to criticism had been more dignified than Frank's own behavior had been throughout the entire encounter. Frank stood in stunned silence for several long moments, struggling to find words that could adequately address what had just occurred. The confident colonel who had been holding court just minutes earlier felt completely humbled by David's quiet dignity and the revelation of his extensive combat service. The crowd around them waited expectantly, sensing that Frank's response would determine whether this encounter ended with mutual respect or continued embarrassment. "Lance Corporal Thompson," Frank said finally, his voice thick with emotion, as he straightened to his own military bearing. "I owe you a profound apology. I have disgraced myself and dishonored your service with my ignorant assumptions and disrespectful commentary." Frank's military training kicked in, reminding him that taking responsibility for mistakes was as important as any other aspect of leadership. David nodded respectfully, appreciating Frank's willingness to acknowledge his error publicly. "Sir, there's no need for apologies between soldiers. We've all made assumptions based on incomplete information. What matters is how we respond when we learn the truth." His generosity in the face of public humiliation demonstrated the kind of character that had earned him his combat decorations. Frank looked around at the crowd that had gathered to hear his criticism of the Royal Guards, realizing that he now had an opportunity to correct the false impressions he had created. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the same authority he had used earlier, but now directed toward a very different purpose. "I want everyone here to understand that I was completely wrong about these soldiers. The tourists, who had been treating Frank as an expert guide, now listened with equal attention as he began to share what he had just learned about the true qualifications and backgrounds of the Royal Guards. These men are not ceremonial decorations or inexperienced soldiers avoiding real duty. They are combat veterans who have served with distinction in the most dangerous places on Earth." Jamie looked up at his grandfather with newfound respect, proud to see Frank taking responsibility for his mistakes rather than trying to justify or minimize them. The 12-year-old was learning an important lesson about the difference between strength that comes from putting others down and strength that comes from admitting when you're wrong. Frank turned back to David, his expression serious and respectful. "Lance Corporal, your service record is exemplary, and your response to my criticism has been more professional and dignified than I deserved. You've reminded me of what real military bearing looks like, and I'm grateful for the lesson." Words carried the sincerity of someone who genuinely understood the magnitude of his error. "Sir," David replied, "one of the things I learned from officers like you is that military service is about more than individual achievement. It's about supporting each other and maintaining the honor of the uniform, even when we disagree or misunderstand each other. Your willingness to acknowledge your mistake shows the kind of leadership that makes the military strong." The crowd began to applaud, moved by the respectful exchange between the two soldiers and impressed by David's gracious handling of a difficult situation. Several tourists approached Frank to express their appreciation for his honesty and their newfound respect for the Royal Guards. The atmosphere had completely transformed from mockery to admiration. Frank reached into his jacket and withdrew a small pin from his own uniform, one of several military decorations he wore when attending formal events. "Lance Corporal Thompson," he said formally, "I would be honored if you would accept this as a token of my respect for your service and your character. It's a unit pin from my regiment, and I'd like you to have it as a reminder that veteran soldiers appreciate what you and your colleagues do here." David accepted the pin with obvious emotion, understanding the significance of the gesture from a decorated veteran officer. "Sir, I'll treasure this, and I'll make sure my fellow guards understand the respect it represents. Thank you for your service and for your example of how to handle mistakes with grace and honor." The exchange represented a complete reversal from the confrontation that had seemed likely just minutes earlier. As the crowd began to disperse, many tourists stopped to thank both Frank and David for the lesson they had witnessed about respect, humility, and professional dignity. Several people mentioned that they would never look at the Royal Guards the same way again, understanding now that the impressive uniforms represented real soldiers with real combat experience. Jamie stayed close to his grandfather as they prepared to leave the palace grounds, processing everything he had observed during the remarkable encounter. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "I think that guard was braver when he was just standing there listening to the mean things you said than when he was fighting in the war." Frank paused at his grandson's observation, struck by the wisdom in the 12-year-old's words. "You're absolutely right, Jamie," he replied thoughtfully. "It takes real courage to endure criticism without responding, especially when that criticism is unfair." Lance Corporal Thompson showed more strength by staying professional than I showed by running my mouth. Before leaving, Frank turned back toward David one final time. The guard had returned to his post and resumed his stoic pose, once again appearing to be the motionless statue that tourists expected to see. But Frank now understood that beneath that disciplined exterior was a soldier whose strength, courage, and character exceeded anything that could be displayed through ceremonial duties. "Thank you, Lance Corporal," Frank said quietly, though he wasn't sure if David could hear him from his position. "Thank you for reminding an old soldier what real dignity looks like." David's slight nod was barely perceptible, but Frank caught it and understood that his words had been heard and appreciated. As Frank and Jamie walked away from the palace, the retired colonel reflected on how completely his understanding had changed in the span of just a few minutes. He had arrived that morning confident in his superiority over ceremonial soldiers, but he was leaving with a profound respect for guards whose service and sacrifice matched his own achievements while displaying a level of professional dignity that Frank realized he needed to emulate. The encounter at Buckingham Palace had a profound impact on Frank that extended far beyond that November morning. In the days that followed, he found himself thinking constantly about David's quiet dignity and professional grace under pressure. The retired colonel realized that his own behavior had reflected poorly, not just on himself, but on the military values he claimed to represent. Frank began researching the selection process and requirements for Royal Guard duty. His assumptions had been wrong in almost every detail. The Guards were indeed chosen from the most elite units of the British Army, with combat experience being a prerequisite rather than a disqualification. The ceremonial duties required the same discipline and attention to detail that made soldiers effective in combat situations. 3 days after their encounter, Frank sat down at his kitchen table and wrote a letter to David, addressing it to Lance Corporal Thompson at the palace barracks. The letter was difficult to write, as Frank struggled to find words that could adequately express his regret and newfound understanding. "Dear Lance Corporal Thompson," Frank wrote, "I have been unable to stop thinking about our encounter at the end palace and the grace with which you handled my disrespectful behavior. Your professionalism and dignity taught me more about military bearing in 10 minutes than I had learned in years of retirement. I wanted you to know that your example has inspired me to examine my own attitudes and behavior toward fellow service members." Frank's letter continued for 3 pages, detailing his research into the Royal Guards and his growing appreciation for the unique challenges of ceremonial duty. He shared stories from his own service that he realized paralleled David's experiences. He acknowledged that his need to feel superior had blinded him to the achievements and sacrifices of other soldiers. Within a week, Frank received a reply from David that was characteristically humble and gracious. The young guard thanked Frank for his letter and expressed appreciation for the veteran officer's willingness to reconsider his assumptions. David also shared more details about his fellow guards and their diverse backgrounds, helping Frank understand the full scope of experience represented in the ceremonial units. "Colonel Mitchell," David wrote, "your letter means more to me than any official commendation could. The fact that a veteran with your experience took the time to research our duties and acknowledge your misunderstanding shows the kind of leadership that makes the military family strong. I hope we can meet again under better circumstances, as I would welcome the opportunity to learn from your extensive experience." Frank was moved by David's continued respect and professionalism, even in private correspondence. The young guard's ability to maintain dignity while extending forgiveness reinforced Frank's growing understanding that true strength came from character rather than from demonstrations of superiority over others. The incident also had a lasting impact on Jamie, who had observed the entire encounter with the clear eyes of childhood. The 12-year-old had seen his grandfather's confidence crumble when confronted with truth. But he had also seen both men handle the situation with eventual grace and mutual respect. Jamie wrote his own letter to David, thanking the guard for teaching him about courage and forgiveness. Dear Mr. Guard, Jamie's letter began in his careful handwriting. Thank you for being nice to my grandpa, even when he said mean things about you. I learned that real soldiers are strong enough to be kind, even when people are unfair to them. I want to be like that when I grow up. David kept Jamie's letter in his personal belongings, touched by the child's understanding of the lesson that had unfolded that day. Frank began sharing the story of his encounter with David whenever the topic of military service arose in conversation. Rather than hiding his embarrassment, he used his mistake as a teaching moment about the dangers of assumptions and the importance of respecting all forms of service. His honesty about his own failings made his message more powerful than any lecture about military values could have been. 6 months after their initial meeting, Frank returned to Buckingham Palace during a changing of the guard ceremony. He brought with him a group of veterans from his local Royal British Legion chapter. Men and women who had served in various conflicts over the past several decades. Frank wanted them to understand what he had learned about the true qualifications and backgrounds of the ceremonial guards. David was not on duty that day, but Frank recognized several of the guards he had met through their correspondence. Stood quietly with his veteran friends, pointing out the precision and professionalism of the ceremony while explaining the combat backgrounds of the soldiers they were watching. His commentary was now filled with respect and admiration rather than criticism and dismissal. After the ceremony, Frank approached the guard commander and introduced himself, explaining about his previous encounter with Lance Corporal Thompson, and requesting the opportunity to address the guards about veteran support and the importance of mutual respect among service members. The commander, who had heard about Frank's transformation from David and other guards, welcomed the opportunity for the veterans to meet. The meeting between Frank's veteran group and the Royal Guards was emotional and powerful. Stories were shared, experiences compared, mutual respect established between soldiers from different generations and different types of service. Frank watched as his own assumptions were challenged and corrected by each conversation, reinforcing his understanding that military service took many forms, all of them deserving of respect. Frank never forgot the lesson that David Thompson had taught him through quiet dignity and professional grace. The encounter had transformed him from an arrogant critic into a humble supporter of all forms of military service. His story became a reminder that true strength comes not from putting others down, but from acknowledging when you're wrong and learning from those you've misjudged. Years later, when Frank was asked about the most important lesson of his long military career, he would always mention his encounter with Lance Corporal David Thompson. Spent 42 years in the Army thinking I knew what real strength looked like, Frank would say. But it took a young guard in a red uniform to show me that the strongest soldiers are those who can endure criticism with dignity and respond to disrespect with grace. David continued his service with the Royal Guards for 2 more years before accepting a promotion and transfer to a training command, where he helped prepare new soldiers for both combat and ceremonial duties. His reputation for professionalism and character had grown throughout the military, partly due to the story of how he had handled Frank's public criticism with such remarkable composure. The friendship between Frank and David continued through letters and occasional meetings, the older officer serving as an unofficial mentor to the younger soldier. As David advanced in his career, their relationship became a symbol of how military service creates bonds that transcend rank, age, and initial misunderstandings. Jamie, now grown and serving as a junior officer himself, often credited his grandfather's encounter with David as the moment that taught him about real leadership. I learned that being a good leader isn't about proving you're better than everyone else, Jamie would tell his own soldiers. It's about admitting when you're wrong and treating everyone with the respect they deserve. Frank's story became legendary among the veteran communities in London, shared at Royal British Legion meetings and military reunions as an example of how assumptions can blind us to the truth about fellow service members. Many veterans began visiting the palace with new eyes, understanding that the guards they were watching represented the same values and sacrifices that they had embraced in their own military careers. the encounter that had begun with arrogance and misunderstanding had evolved into a lasting lesson about respect, humility, and the many forms that strength can take. Frank Mitchell had learned that real military bearing wasn't about demonstrating superiority over others, but about maintaining dignity under all circumstances and supporting fellow soldiers regardless of their assignments or backgrounds. David Thompson had shown that true courage sometimes means standing still and accepting criticism rather than fighting back, and that the strongest response to disrespect is often simply maintaining your own integrity and professionalism. Together, they had created a moment that reminded everyone present that military service, in all its forms, deserves recognition and respect from those who understand the sacrifices it requires.